The desert sun had already bleached 3 of Margaret Whitmore's expensive Eastern notebooks by the time she noticed the cowboy watching her from beneath the twisted mesquite tree. And by then, he had been studying her daily routine for nearly 2 weeks. Margaret knelt in the red dirt outside Enid, Oklahoma Territory, her split skirt dusty and her white blouse stained with sweat and soil despite the early morning hour. The year was 1897, and she had traveled from Boston with trunks full of scientific equipment, drawing supplies, and an unshakable determination to document every desert plant species within 100 miles. Her father, a professor at Harvard, had scoffed at her ambitions. Her mother had simply fainted, but Margaret had boarded that train anyway, clutching her leather journal and her references from the few scientists who believed a woman could contribute to botanical knowledge. She pressed her magnifying glass closer to the succulent before her, sketching the precise arrangement of its thick leaves in her notebook. The plant had adapted remarkably to conserve water, and she wanted to capture every detail of its structure. Her pencil moved quickly across the page, her hand steady despite the heat that already shimmered across the endless Oklahoma plain. From his position under the mesquite, Owen Morrison shifted his weight and his horse snorted softly. He had been riding fence line for the Double M Ranch when he first spotted her 3 days after she arrived in Enid, wandering into the wilderness alone with nothing but a canvas bag and her notebooks. At first, he thought she was lost, some foolish Eastern woman who would perish within hours. He had followed at a distance, ready to rescue her when she inevitably panicked and needed help finding her way back to town. But she never got lost. She never panicked. She simply walked from plant to plant with purpose, kneeling in the dirt without concern for her clothing, sketching and writing and occasionally talking to herself. Owen found himself returning each day, watching her work, fascinated by her complete absorption in her task. He told himself he was just making sure she stayed safe. The Oklahoma Territory was dangerous for anyone alone, let alone a woman who seemed completely unaware of her surroundings. Margaret sat back on her heels and wiped her forehead with her sleeve, leaving a streak of dirt across her face. Her dark hair had escaped its pins and hung in damp curls around her neck. She was 23 years old, and this was the first time in her life she had felt truly free. No parlors, no tea parties, no tedious conversations about weather and gossip, just her and the plants and the vast open sky. She gathered her supplies and stood, brushing off her skirt. Her next destination was a cluster of prickly pear cacti she had spotted yesterday about a quarter-mile south. She had read about their fruit being edible, but she wanted to document their flowering cycle and the relationship between the plant and the insects that pollinated them. Owen watched her walk south and nudged his horse forward, maintaining his distance. He had grown up on ranches, worked cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, and could shoot a rattlesnake at 20 paces. But this woman, with her books and her complete dedication to plants she could not eat or sell, had captured his attention in a way he did not fully understand. She was pretty, certainly, but it was more than that. There was something about the way she moved through the world, completely engaged with what she was doing, that made him want to know her. Margaret reached the prickly pear and set down her bag. She pulled out her journal and began a new page, dating it carefully at the top. As she bent to examine the base of the nearest cactus, she heard the soft sound of a horse shifting behind her. She froze, her heart suddenly racing. She had assumed she was alone out here, as she had been every day since arriving in Enid. Slowly, she turned around. Owen sat astride his buckskin gelding about 30 feet away, his hat pulled low against the sun. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that needed cutting. His blue shirt was faded from many washings, and he wore his gun belt with the ease of someone who had carried a weapon most of his life. He looked to be in his mid-20s, and his expression was cautious, almost apologetic. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "Did not mean to startle you." Margaret stood, her hand pressed against her chest. "How long have you been following me?" Owen had the grace to look embarrassed. "A couple of weeks, I reckon. Not following exactly, just keeping an eye out. These parts can be dangerous." "Dangerous?" Margaret looked around at the empty landscape. "I have not seen another soul in days." "That is because I made sure the cattle were moved to the eastern sections while you were working out here," Owen said. "And I ran off a group of drifters who were heading this way last Tuesday, and shot a rattler that was about 2 feet from where you were sitting yesterday afternoon, though you were so focused on that yellow flower you never heard it." Margaret felt her face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. "You have been watching me for 2 weeks without introducing yourself. I reckon that does sound peculiar when you put it that way." Owen dismounted and walked his horse closer, stopping a respectful distance away. "Owen Morrison. I work for the Double M Ranch, which owns most of the land you have been walking on." "I am trespassing?" Margaret asked, alarmed. She could not afford to be run off this land. She had barely begun her research. "I did not say that." Owen removed his hat, revealing light brown hair matted with sweat. "I was just explaining why I have been out here. Part of my job is riding fence and checking on things, and you have been one of the things I have been checking on." Margaret studied him carefully. He had an honest face, weathered by sun and wind, with direct gray eyes that met hers without guile. He did not look threatening, but she knew better than to be foolish. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she did not know. As if reading her thoughts, Owen said, "I will leave you to your work if you want. But I thought I should introduce myself proper, since we have been sharing this land for a while now. And I wanted you to know that if you need anything, or if you get into trouble, I am usually within shouting distance." "Why would you do that?" Margaret asked. "Watch over me, I mean. You do not know me." Owen turned his hat in his hands, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "I suppose because you seem to need it, and because I have never seen anyone quite like you before. Most folks look at the desert and see nothing or see obstacles. You look at it and see something worth studying. I found that interesting." Despite her wariness, Margaret felt her curiosity stir. "You think the desert is worth studying?" "I think anything that keeps a creature alive out here is worth understanding," Owen said. "I have seen cattle die because they ate the wrong plant. I have seen men perish for lack of water while standing 50 feet from a barrel cactus that could have saved them. Knowledge about this land is the difference between living and dying." Margaret felt her defensive posture soften slightly. "That is precisely why I am here. To document these plants, to understand their adaptations, to create a record that might help people understand this environment." "You come all the way from back east to do that?" Owen asked. "Boston. My father is a professor of natural sciences at Harvard. I have been assisting with his research for years, but women are not permitted to enroll in the graduate programs. So I decided to come out here and conduct my own original research. If I can document enough species, create detailed enough illustrations and descriptions, perhaps I can publish a paper that will establish my credentials." Owen whistled low. "That is a mighty big undertaking for someone working alone." "I am aware of the challenges," Margaret said stiffly. She had heard enough doubts and dismissals to last a lifetime. "I was not criticizing," Owen said quickly. "I was admiring. Takes courage to come out here alone, to do something most folks would say you should not be doing." Margaret looked at him with new interest. You do not think it is inappropriate for a woman to conduct scientific research? Owen shrugged. I think it is inappropriate to tell anyone they cannot do something just because of how they were born. I have known women who could outride, outshoot, and outsmart most men I have met. Seems foolish to waste all that capability. For the first time since arriving in Oklahoma Territory, Margaret smiled genuinely. That is a remarkably progressive view, Mr. Morrison. Just common sense, miss. He paused, realizing he did not know her name. Whitmore, Margaret Whitmore. Miss Whitmore. He settled his hat back on his head. I will let you get back to your work, but if you do not mind, I will keep checking on you, not watching exactly, just making sure you are safe out here. Margaret considered this. Part of her wanted to refuse, to assert her independence and her ability to manage on her own. But the practical part of her brain, the part trained in scientific observation, noted that he had already saved her from a rattlesnake she had not even noticed. Pride was all well and good, but survival was better. I suppose that would be acceptable, she said carefully, as long as you do not interfere with my work. Would not dream of it, Owen said. He mounted his horse with easy grace. Though if you are planning to be out here tomorrow, you might want to start earlier. There is a storm building to the west. Should hit around mid-afternoon. Margaret looked at the cloudless sky skeptically. Owen followed her gaze and smiled slightly. Trust me. You spend enough time out here, you learn to read the signs. That haze on the horizon, the way the birds are flying low, the feel of the air. Storm is coming. I will keep that in mind, Margaret said. Owen touched his hat brim in farewell and rode off, leaving Margaret alone with her prickly pear cacti. She watched him go, then turned back to her work. But she found her concentration slightly disturbed, her thoughts returning periodically to the cowboy with the gray eyes who had been watching over her without her knowledge. She worked until noon, filling several pages with detailed drawings and observations. The heat was intense, and she drank carefully from her canteen, knowing she needed to conserve water for the walk back to town. She had rented a small room above the general store in Enid, and each morning she walked out into the desert, and each evening she walked back, her head full of botanical observations and her body exhausted but satisfied. As she packed up her supplies, she noticed the sky had begun to change. Clouds were building on the western horizon, just as Owen had predicted. The air felt different too, heavier somehow, charged with potential energy. She wondered how he had known and found herself wanting to ask him about it, to understand how he read the landscape with such accuracy. The next morning, Margaret rose before dawn and made the walk out to a new location, a dried creek bed where she hoped to find different species adapted to seasonal water flow. She had been working for perhaps an hour when she heard a horse approaching. She looked up to find Owen riding toward her, leading a second horse. "Morning," he called as he drew near. "Thought you might like to cover more ground today. This mare is gentle as a kitten, and she will get you out farther than you can walk." Margaret stood, wiping her hands on her skirt. "I do not know how to ride." Owen looked genuinely shocked. "You have been walking 10 miles a day in this heat, and you do not know how to ride." "It is not a common skill for women in Boston," Margaret said defensively. "Well, it is a common skill out here, and it would make your work a lot easier." Owen dismounted and held the mare's reins. "I could teach you. Basic stuff, just enough to get you around safely." Margaret looked at the horse dubiously. It was a gray mare with a white blaze down its face, and it did indeed look calm. The idea of being able to cover more territory was appealing. She had already walked past several promising locations that were simply too far to reach on foot and still return to town before dark. "I suppose it would be practical," she admitted. Owen smiled. a genuine expression that transformed his usually serious face. "Come on then, we will start simple." He spent the next hour teaching her the basics of mounting, sitting properly, holding the reins, and the simple commands to make the horse walk and stop. Margaret was a quick study, and soon she was walking the mare in circles around the creek bed, her confidence growing with each successful circuit. "You are a natural," Owen said, and she could hear the approval in his voice. "Tomorrow we will work on trotting, and within a week you will be riding well enough to get anywhere you need to go." "I cannot afford to buy a horse," Margaret said, the practical concern suddenly occurring to her. "This is a ranch horse. She is just getting exercised either way." "You can borrow her while you are doing your research. Consider it part of the land use agreement." "There is no land use agreement," Margaret pointed out. "There is now. You can study whatever plants you want on Double M land, and you can use Sally here for transportation. In exchange, you will let me know if you find any plants that are dangerous for cattle, and you will accept my help in staying safe out here." Margaret brought the mare to a halt and looked down at Owen. "Why are you doing this, truly?" Owen met her gaze steadily. "Because I have spent most of my life working with cattle and horses and men who think a good conversation is about weather and poker. And then you showed up, so focused on your work that you would kneel in the dirt in your fancy Boston clothes just to look at a plant most people would walk right past. You made me see this land differently. You made me wonder about things I have always taken for granted. I suppose I want to understand what you see when you look at all this." It was perhaps the longest speech Margaret had heard him make, and the honesty in it touched something in her chest. She had been alone in her passion for so long, dismissed by her family, tolerated but not understood by the few scientists who acknowledged her work. To hear this cowboy say he wanted to understand her perspective felt like a gift. "All right," she said softly. "I accept your help. And your agreement. Thank you, Owen." The use of his first name felt natural, and he smiled again. "You are welcome, Margaret." They fell into a routine after that. Each morning, Owen would meet her at the edge of town with Sally, and he would ride alongside her as she explored new areas. He taught her to read the land the way he did, pointing out the signs of water, the marks of animal passages, the subtle changes in vegetation that indicated different soil types. In return, she shared her botanical knowledge, explaining plant adaptations and ecological relationships, teaching him the Latin names and the scientific principles that governed desert plant survival. 3 weeks into their arrangement, they were investigating a rocky outcropping when Margaret found a plant she did not recognize. It had silvery leaves and a compact growing habit, tucked into a crack in the red stone. "I have not seen this species in any of my references," she said excitedly, pulling out her notebook. "It could be something rare, or perhaps even undocumented." Owen dismounted and came to stand beside her, looking at the plant with new interest. Over the past weeks, Margaret had taught him to see what she saw, the small differences that distinguished one species from another. "What makes it special? The leaf structure is unique. See how the leaves are almost cylindrical, very narrow. That is an extreme adaptation to reduce water loss. And the color, that silver, suggests a waxy coating for additional protection, but the overall form does not match any species I know." Her voice was animated, her face flushed with excitement. Owen found himself watching her instead of the plant, struck by how beautiful she was when she was lit up with enthusiasm like this. Her dark hair had escaped its pins again, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She had lost the formal stiffness she had carried when she first arrived from Boston, and the desert sun had brought color to her skin. She looked alive and real and completely herself. "You should document it thoroughly," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "If it is new to science, you will want a complete record." Margaret spent 2 hours measuring, drawing, and describing the plant from every angle. Owen sat in the shade of an overhanging rock and watched her work, content just to be near her. He had long since admitted to himself that his interest in Margaret went far beyond ensuring her safety. Somewhere between teaching her to ride and learning the Latin name for creosote bush, he had fallen in love with her, but he had no idea if she felt anything similar. She seemed to enjoy his company, and she listened when he talked about the ranch or his life on the frontier. But her real passion was clearly her work, and he did not know if there was room in her heart for anything else. Besides, he was just a cowboy with no formal education beyond basic reading and writing. She was a scientist from Boston with a Harvard professor for a father. What could he possibly offer her? "Done," Margaret announced, closing her notebook with satisfaction. "Now I need to take a sample to press and preserve. If this is a new species, I will need physical evidence along with my documentation." She carefully removed a small section of the plant, wrapping it in cloth to protect it. As she worked, a shadow passed over them, and Owen looked up to see dark clouds building rapidly overhead. The temperature had dropped noticeably in the past few minutes. "We need to get back to town," Owen said, standing quickly. "That storm is moving faster than I expected." They mounted their horses and began riding back toward Enid. They had covered about half the distance when the wind picked up dramatically, whipping dust and small debris across the plain. Lightning flickered in the dark clouds, and thunder rolled across the sky. "There is an old line shack about a mile north," Owen shouted over the wind. "We can shelter there until this passes." Margaret nodded, gripping Sally's reins tightly as the mare began to dance nervously. Owen reached over and grabbed the reins near the bit, leading Sally while controlling his own mount. They rode hard for the line shack, racing against the storm. They reached the small wooden structure just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Owen dismounted quickly and helped Margaret down, then led both horses to the lean-to shelter attached to the back of the shack. By the time he got the door open and they stumbled inside, the rain was falling in sheets, turning the world outside into a gray blur. The line shack was a single room with a small stove, a rough table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed frame with a bare mattress. It smelled of old wood and dust, but it was dry and solid. Owen checked the stove and found dry wood already stacked beside it. "I will get a fire going," he said. "Take the chill off." Margaret set down her bag carefully, making sure her precious sample was protected. Her clothes were damp and she was starting to shiver, both from cold and from the adrenaline of their race against the storm. She watched Owen work, his movements efficient and practiced as he built the fire. Within minutes, warm light filled the room and heat began to radiate from the stove. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I should have been paying more attention to the weather." "You were focused on your discovery," Owen said. "That plant was worth getting excited about. I just should have noticed the storm building sooner." Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it shook the small building. Margaret jumped slightly, and Owen moved closer instinctively. "It is all right," he said. "We are safe here. These shacks are built to withstand Oklahoma storms." Margaret nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. She was not actually afraid of the storm, she realized. She was nervous about being alone with Owen in this small space, about the way her awareness of him seemed to have intensified. Over the past weeks, she had grown comfortable with him, had come to look forward to seeing him each morning. But she had told herself it was just friendship, just the natural connection between two people working together toward a common goal. Now, in the close confines of the shack, With the storm raging outside and firelight casting shadows across his face, she could not pretend any more. She had feelings for Owen Morrison that went far beyond friendship. "You are staring at me," Owen said softly, and she realized he had turned to look at her. "I apologize," Margaret said, flustered. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She should make something up, change the subject, maintain the professional distance that was proper for a lady scientist and her guide. But Margaret had never been good at lying, and she was tired of pretending. "About how much I have come to value your company," she said carefully. "About how these weeks working with you have been the happiest I can remember." Owen went very still. "Margaret, I know it is not proper for me to speak so directly," she continued quickly, "and I know I should focus solely on my work. But I would be dishonest if I did not acknowledge that my feelings for you have become complicated." "Complicated how?" Owen asked, his voice low. Margaret took a breath, committing to honesty. "I think I have developed a romantic attachment to you, which is entirely impractical, of course. I am here temporarily for my research. You have your life on the ranch. We come from completely different worlds. But nonetheless, the feelings exist, and I felt you should know." The silence that followed felt endless. Margaret kept her eyes on the floor, mortified by her confession but unable to take it back. She had just ruined everything, destroyed their easy partnership with her inappropriate declaration. Then Owen crossed the space between them in 3 strides, and before she could react, he had cupped her face in his hands and was looking at her with an intensity that stole her breath. "I have been in love with you since the day I saw you talking to a barrel cactus like it was an old friend," he said. "I have spent every day since trying to figure out how to tell you, how to make you see me as something more than just the cowboy who keeps you safe. Margaret, you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met. You are brilliant and brave and passionate about what you do. You make the world bigger just by being in it." "Owen," she whispered, her hands coming up to cover his where they rested against her cheeks. "I know I am not what you should want," he continued. "I have no formal education, no prospects beyond ranch work. I cannot offer you a life in Boston society or academic recognition, but I can love you with everything I have. I can support your work and celebrate your discoveries. I can be your partner in all of this if you will let me." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the raw emotion in his words. "I do not want Boston society. I do not want the life my parents planned for me. I want this, Owen. I want the desert and the plants and the freedom to do my work. And I want you." He kissed her then, softly at first as if afraid she might pull away. But Margaret pressed closer, her arms wrapping around his neck, kissing him back with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks. His arms came around her waist, pulling her against him, and the kiss deepened, becoming urgent and desperate and perfect. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for so long." "I wish you had done it sooner," Margaret said, and he laughed, the sound full of joy and relief. They stayed in the lined shack until the storm passed, talking about everything and nothing, stealing kisses between conversations, making plans for a future they had both been afraid to imagine. Owen told her about growing up on a small ranch in Texas, losing his parents to fever when he was 16, working his way north through various cattle operations, until he landed at the Double M. Margaret told him about the suffocating expectations of Boston society, the constant battle to be taken seriously as a scientist, the exhilaration and terror of boarding that train west with no certainty about what she would find. "What will your parents say when you tell them about me?" Owen asked as the rain slowed to a drizzle outside. "They will be horrified," Margaret said honestly. "They have been trying to arrange a suitable marriage for me for years, A cowboy from Oklahoma Territory is about as far from suitable as they can imagine. Does that bother you?" "Not even a little bit," Margaret said firmly. "I have spent my whole life trying to please them, trying to fit into their expectations while pursuing my own dreams. I am done living for their approval. I am going to live for myself and for you, and for the work that matters to me." Owen kissed her again, softly and reverently. "I love you, Margaret Whitmore." "I love you too, Owen Morrison." When they finally rode back to Enid, the world looked washed clean by the rain, the colors more vivid and the air fresh. They were both muddy and disheveled, and Margaret knew her reputation would be in tatters once people realized she had been alone with Owen in that lined shack for hours. But she found she did not care. For the first time in her life, she had exactly what she wanted. Over the next months, their relationship deepened as they continued their work together. Margaret made significant progress on her botanical survey, documenting over 200 species and discovering 3 that appeared to be previously unrecorded. Owen helped her construct proper drying presses and organized her growing collection of specimens. He was fascinated by her work and asked intelligent questions that often led her to new insights. In return, Margaret learned the skills of frontier life from Owen. She became a competent rider, could shoot a rifle well enough to protect herself, and learned to read weather and landscape with increasing accuracy. She also fell more deeply in love with him every day, touched by his kindness, his curiosity, and his unwavering support for her ambitions. They married in December, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Enid. Margaret wore a practical blue dress instead of a white gown, and Owen borrowed a suit from the ranch foreman. There were no guests from Boston, her parents having responded to her letter with icy silence. But the ceremony was witnessed by several ranch hands who had become friends, and the woman who ran the boarding house made them a small cake. They moved into a cabin on the Double M Ranch, a 2-room structure that Owen had spent weeks fixing up. It was small and simple, but it had good light for Margaret's drawing work and space for her growing collection of specimens and books. Owen built her a work table and shelves, and he surprised her with a brass microscope ordered from a catalog, spending 6 months' wages to give her something he knew she needed. "Owen, this is too much," Margaret protested when she unwrapped it on Christmas morning. "It is an investment in your work," he said firmly. "Your research is important and you need proper equipment. Besides, watching you get excited about plant cells is one of my favorite things." She kissed him thoroughly, and the microscope was temporarily forgotten. Life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Owen worked during the day, and Margaret conducted her research, often riding Sally out to new locations with her increasingly sophisticated collection of tools and equipment. In the evenings, they would sit together at their small table, Owen mending tack or cleaning his gun while Margaret worked on her drawings and notes. They talked about everything, their conversations ranging from ranch business to botanical theory to plans for the future. In the spring, Margaret received a letter from a scientific journal in New York. She had sent them samples and drawings of her 3 potentially new species along with her detailed documentation. The editor wrote that they were extremely interested in publishing her findings, pending verification by their consulting botanists. It was not quite the acceptance she hoped for, but it was recognition from the scientific community, acknowledgement that her work had value. "They are taking you seriously," Owen said, reading the letter over her shoulder. "This is wonderful, Margaret." "It is conditional," she cautioned, not wanting to get her hopes up too high. "It is a yes. They just need to verify it through their process." "But they are going to publish your research." He wrapped his arms around her from behind. "I am so proud of you." 2 months later, another letter arrived, The species had been verified as new to science, and the journal was proceeding with publication. Moreover, the editors wanted to know if Margaret would be interested in submitting additional articles about desert plant adaptations. They were particularly interested in her observations about water conservation strategies and her detailed anatomical drawings. Margaret sat at the table with the letter in shaking hands, unable to quite believe it was real. She was going to be a published scientist. Her work would be in a legitimate journal, available to researchers and students across the country. It was everything she had dreamed of when she boarded that train from Boston. "Owen," she called, her voice unsteady. "Owen, come read this." He came in from the corral where he had been working with a green horse, still dusty and sweaty. When he read the letter, his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen. He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing. "You did it," he said when he set her down. "You proved all of them wrong." "We did it," Margaret corrected. "I could not have done this without your help, Owen. You made it possible for me to do the work. You are the brilliant scientist. I just made sure you did not get bit by rattlesnakes while you were doing it." "You did much more than that," Margaret said seriously. "You believed in me when almost no one else did. You supported my work and helped me in countless ways. You are my partner in all of this." Owen kissed her forehead gently. "Partners, then, in science and in life." Margaret's first article was published in the fall of 1898, with her name clearly printed as the author, Margaret Morrison. She had taken Owen's last name when they married, and seeing it in print in a scientific journal gave her a fierce satisfaction. She was a scientist and a wife, and those identities did not conflict. If anything, they reinforced each other. The article received positive attention, and she began receiving correspondence from other researchers interested in desert ecology. Some of the letters were from women, thanking her for showing that female scientists could do serious field work. Those letters meant more to her than any academic praise. She continued her research, expanding her focus to include the relationships between plants and the animals that depended on them. She documented pollination patterns, seed dispersal mechanisms, and the complex web of life that existed in what many people dismissed as barren wasteland. Owen helped her construct observation blinds where she could watch animals without disturbing them, and he taught her to track and identify different species by their signs. In the winter of 1899, Margaret realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a complex mixture of emotions. She was happy, certainly, and Owen was overjoyed, but she worried about how motherhood would affect her research. She had worked so hard to establish herself as a serious scientist. Would she be able to continue her work with a child to care for? Owen found her sitting at her work table one evening, staring blankly at her notes, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "What are you thinking?" he asked gently, sitting down beside her. "I am thinking about all the ways this changes things," Margaret admitted. "I want this child. I want our family, but I also want to continue my work, and I do not know if that is possible." "Why would it not be possible?" Owen asked, genuinely puzzled. "Because women do not do both. They are mothers or they are professionals, but not both. Society does not allow for both." Owen took her hand in his. "Margaret, when have you ever cared what society thinks you should do? You left Boston to study plants in Oklahoma Territory. You married a cowboy against your parents' wishes. You became a published scientist when everyone said women could not do serious research. Why would you start limiting yourself now?" "Because a child is different," Margaret said softly. "A child needs care and attention. I will not be one of those mothers who neglects her children for her own pursuits." "You could never be that kind of mother," Owen said firmly. "You care too much about everything you do, but that does not mean you have to give up your work. We will figure it out together, just like we have figured out everything else. Maybe you will do field work closer to home for a while, or maybe we will take the baby with us sometimes. Children are more adaptable than people think, and I will be here helping with everything." Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks. "You would do that? Help care for the baby even though it is traditionally women's work?" "I will do whatever needs doing," Owen said simply. "I am your partner, remember, in all things." Their son was born in July of 1900, during the hottest part of summer. They named him Oliver, and he was healthy and strong with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. Margaret recovered quickly from the birth, and true to his word, Owen was an involved father from the beginning. He learned to change diapers and prepare bottles, and he would walk the floor with Oliver when the baby was fussy, singing old cowboy songs in his rough voice until Oliver settled. Margaret did reduce her field work for the first few months, focusing instead on writing and organizing her existing notes. She had years of observations to work through, and the enforced time at home allowed her to make significant progress on what she was beginning to think of as a book, rather than just a series of articles. When Oliver was 4 months old, they began taking him on short expeditions. Margaret fashioned a sling to carry him against her chest while she worked, and Owen built a small portable shade structure to protect the baby from the harsh sun. Oliver seemed content to sleep or observe his surroundings while his mother studied plants and his father kept watch. "He is going to grow up thinking that field research is completely normal," Owen observed one afternoon, watching Margaret sketch while Oliver dozed against her. "That is because it is normal," Margaret said. "For our family, at least." They developed a new routine that accommodated Oliver's needs while still allowing Margaret to continue her work. Some days, Owen would stay home with Oliver while Margaret went into the field. Other days, they all went together. And some days, Margaret worked at home while Owen handled ranch duties. It was not always easy, and there were times when Margaret felt pulled in too many directions. But Owen's unwavering support and his equal sharing of parental responsibilities made it possible. Margaret's second major article was published when Oliver was 6 months old. It focused on the relationship between certain desert plants and the insects that pollinated them, and it included detailed observations and illustrations that represented hundreds of hours of field work. The article was well received, and more importantly, it was cited by other researchers as a significant contribution to the field. "You are becoming famous in botanical circles," Owen teased, reading a letter from another scientist who wanted to correspond with Margaret about her methods. "I am becoming respected," Margaret corrected. "There is a difference. Fame is fleeting. Respect, professional respect, is something I can build a career on." "Will you write the book?" Owen asked. He knew she had been thinking about it for months. "I think I have to," Margaret said slowly. "I have documented so much, learned so much, and it deserves to be shared in a comprehensive way, but it will take years to complete." "Then we have years," Owen said simply. "We are not going anywhere." Over the next several years, Margaret worked steadily on her book while continuing to publish smaller articles. Owen was promoted to foreman of the Double M Ranch, a position that came with more responsibility and better pay. They were able to expand their cabin, adding a proper study for Margaret with built-in shelves for her growing library and specimen collection. Oliver grew into a curious, energetic child who loved being outdoors. He learned to identify common plants before he learned to read, and he would follow his mother around during her field work, asking endless questions about everything he saw. Owen taught him to ride almost as soon as he could walk, and by the time he was 5, Oliver could sit a horse competently and help with simple ranch tasks. In 1904, Margaret's book was finally complete. Desert Flora of the Oklahoma Territory. A comprehensive survey of plant species and their adaptations was 400 pages long and included over 300 detailed illustrations, all drawn by Margaret herself. Finding a publisher willing to take on such a specialized work by a female author proved challenging, but eventually a university press in New York agreed to publish it. The book came out in 1905 to positive reviews in scientific journals. It was praised for its thoroughness, the quality of its illustrations, and the accessibility of Margaret's writing. She had managed to be scientifically rigorous while still making the material engaging for educated general readers. The book sold steadily, not becoming a bestseller, but earning a respected place in the libraries of universities and research institutions. More importantly to Margaret, the book established her as a legitimate authority on desert botany. She began receiving invitations to speak at universities and scientific meetings. Some of these she declined, not wanting to be away from Oliver and Owen for extended periods. But she accepted a few, traveling to Kansas City and St. Louis to present her research to academic audiences. "How does it feel?" Owen asked after she returned from a particularly successful lecture in St. Louis. "Being recognized as an expert, having people seek out your knowledge, it feels like vindication," Margaret admitted, "but also like responsibility. I have a platform now and I want to use it well. I want to encourage other women to pursue science, to show them it is possible." "You are doing that just by being yourself and doing your work," Owen said. In 1906, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she was more confident about balancing motherhood and her career. She knew from experience that it was possible, if challenging. Their daughter was born in early 1907, and they named her Emma. She was a calm baby, easier than Oliver had been, and she seemed content to be carried around during field work just as her brother had been. Oliver, now 7, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. He would bring Margaret diapers and blankets, and he would sit next to Emma's cradle, telling her about the plants and animals he had seen that day. It was clear he had inherited his mother's observational skills and his father's love of the land. Life continued in this pattern for several years. Margaret worked on a second book, this one focusing specifically on the medicinal properties of desert plants. She had become interested in the traditional knowledge of the Native American tribes in the region, and she spent time interviewing anyone willing to share information about how various plants had been used historically. It was delicate work, building trust with people who had every reason to be suspicious of white settlers. But Margaret approached it with respect and genuine interest in preserving knowledge that was at risk of being lost. Owen supported this work as he had supported everything else, and he used his connections in the ranching community to arrange introductions and vouch for Margaret's integrity. Slowly, she built relationships with several Native women who shared their knowledge of plant medicine, and Margaret documented it carefully, always giving credit to her sources and respecting their wishes about what information could be shared publicly. In 1910, when Oliver was 10 and Emma was 3, the Double M Ranch was sold to a larger cattle operation. The new owners brought in their own management team, which meant Owen was out of a job. It was a blow, but also an opportunity. "I have been thinking," Owen said one evening after the children were in bed. "We have been living according to the needs of the ranch for our whole marriage. Maybe it is time we lived according to our own needs." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "I mean, what if we bought our own land? Not for ranching on a large scale, just enough to support ourselves and give you easy access to the areas you need for your research. We have saved some money, and the book has brought in income. We could make it work." Margaret felt excitement flutter in her chest. Our own land, where we could do exactly what we wanted, research what we wanted, without having to work around anyone else's schedule or priorities. "Exactly," Owen said. "We could build a proper house with a real laboratory space for you. We could construct observation stations and experimental plots. We could make it a place dedicated to understanding and preserving this ecosystem." Over the next several months, they searched for the right property. They finally found it in the spring of 1911, 160 acres about 15 miles from Enid. It had a good, varied terrain including both flat prairie and rocky outcroppings, and a diversity of plant communities. It was perfect for Margaret's research and sufficient for Owen to run a small herd of cattle and some horses. They used most of their savings for the down payment and took out a loan for the rest. It was financially risky, but they both believed it was worth it. They spent the summer building their new home, a solid 2-story house with a room dedicated entirely to Margaret's scientific work. Owen built shelving and work surfaces to her exact specifications, and they installed the best windows they could afford to provide excellent natural light. They moved in that fall, and Margaret felt a sense of coming home that she had not experienced since leaving Boston over a decade earlier. This was theirs, built to accommodate their unusual life and their shared commitment to understanding the natural world. Oliver thrived on their new property. He was old enough now to be a real help with the daily work, and he spent hours exploring every corner of their land. He showed a particular aptitude for tracking and observing animal behavior, and Margaret encouraged this interest, teaching him scientific observation methods and how to keep detailed field notes. Emma, at 4, was still mostly interested in collecting pretty rocks and following her brother around. But she already showed signs of inheriting the family curiosity, always asking why and how about everything she encountered. In 1912, Margaret was invited to present her research at a major scientific conference in Chicago. It was a significant honor, and she wanted to accept. But it would mean being away from home for over a week, and she worried about leaving Owen alone with both children and all the ranch work. "You should go," Owen said firmly when she expressed her concerns. "This is important for your career. Oliver is 11 now, old enough to be a real help. And Emma and I will manage just fine for a week. You have earned this opportunity, Margaret. Do not turn it down out of guilt." So Margaret went to Chicago, her first time in a major city since leaving Boston. She presented her research to a large audience of scientists and academics, and her talk was well received. Several attendees approached her afterward, wanting to discuss her work in more detail. She met other women scientists, rare but present, and they shared stories of the challenges they faced and strategies for overcoming them. But more than the professional success, what struck Margaret was how much she missed Owen and the children. She found herself thinking about them constantly, wishing they could see the impressive buildings and bustling streets of Chicago, wanting to share each experience with Owen. She realized that while her work was important to her, it was her family that made her truly happy. She returned home with a renewed appreciation for the life they had built. Their property was isolated, their work was hard, and they would never be wealthy. But they had love and partnership and the freedom to pursue their passions. That was worth more than any amount of conventional success. The years passed in a pattern of work and growth. Margaret's second book was published in 1914, and it too was well received. She continued to publish articles regularly, and she began mentoring other women who wanted to pursue botanical research. She corresponded with dozens of female students and aspiring scientists, offering advice and encouragement. Owen built their ranch into a profitable small operation. He had a good eye for horses, and he developed a reputation for breeding and training quality ranch horses. He also helped Margaret with her increasingly complex research projects, acting as field assistant, illustrator when she needed help with technical drawings, and sounding board for her ideas. Oliver graduated from the Enid School in 1916 at age 16. He was torn between wanting to pursue formal scientific education and wanting to stay and work with his family. In the end, he decided to attend the Oklahoma Agricultural and Mechanical College, where he could study both agriculture and natural sciences. It was close enough that he could come home regularly, and the practical focus of the program appealed to him. Emma, at 9, was showing signs of having inherited her mother's artistic ability. Her plant sketches were remarkably detailed and accurate, and Margaret began teaching her scientific illustration techniques. Emma loved the work, and mother and daughter would often sit side by side at the big table in Margaret's study, both drawing and labeling specimens. In 1917, America entered the Great War. Oliver was only 17, too young to be drafted, but many young men from the area enlisted or were called up. The war felt distant from their property outside Enid, but they felt its effects in supply shortages and the absence of neighbors who went to fight. Margaret used the war years to focus on her research into the nutritional and medicinal properties of native plants. If they were cut off from traditional supply lines, she reasoned, people would need to know how to use local resources. She published several articles with practical information about which plants were safe to eat, which had medicinal properties, and how to prepare them. The information was picked up by newspapers and agricultural extension services, distributed much more widely than her usual academic publications. "You are doing war work," Owen observed, reading one of the newspaper articles that had reprinted her information. "Helping people survive difficult times." "I suppose I am," Margaret said. "I never thought of it that way, but you are right. Knowledge is a form of service." The war ended in 1918, and life slowly returned to normal. Oliver graduated from college in 1920 with a degree in agricultural science, and he surprised everyone by announcing his intention to pursue graduate studies in ecology. He wanted to build on his mother's work, expanding it to look at entire ecosystems rather than just plant species in isolation. "You inspired me," he told Margaret. "Everything I want to study, all the questions I am asking, they started from watching you work and learning from you. I want to continue that work in my own way." Margaret felt pride swell in her chest. Her son was going to be a scientist, continuing the work she had started. It felt like the greatest accomplishment of her life. Emma, at 13, was still undecided about her future. She loved art but also loved the outdoors. She talked about becoming a scientific illustrator, providing drawings for other researchers' publications. It was a career that would allow her to combine all her interests and skills. In 1922, Margaret received an invitation that shocked her. Harvard University wanted her to come give a series of guest lectures on desert ecology. Harvard, where her father had taught, where she had been denied entry to the graduate program 25 years earlier because of her gender. Now they were inviting her as a distinguished researcher and author of 2 significant scientific texts. "You have to go," Owen said immediately. "This is your vindication, Margaret. This is Harvard admitting they were wrong." Margaret agreed, and in the fall of 1922 she traveled to Boston. It was her first time back in the city since she had left in 1897. The city had grown and changed, and she felt like a stranger in the place where she had spent the first 23 years of her life. Her father had died 5 years earlier, and her mother had passed just the previous year. She had reconciled with neither of them, though she had sent letters over the years updating them on her life and accomplishments. They had never responded, and she had eventually stopped trying. Still, she felt a pang of sadness that they had never been able to accept her choices or take pride in her achievements. Her lectures at Harvard were well attended, and she was introduced as Dr. Margaret Morrison, an honorary title based on her published work and contributions to the field, even though she had never earned a formal degree. The irony was not lost on her, and she addressed it directly in her first lecture. "I stand before you as proof that the pursuit of knowledge cannot be confined by institutional barriers," she said. 25 years ago, I was denied admission to graduate programs because of my gender, so I went into the field and did the work anyway. I documented over 300 plant species, discovered new species previously unknown to science, and published 2 books that are now used in university courses. I did this without institutional support, without formal credentials, and often without recognition. I did it because the work mattered more than the obstacles. Her lectures received standing ovations, and several female students approached her afterward to thank her for her example and her encouragement. Those conversations reminded Margaret why her work had been important. It was not just about the plants. It was about opening doors for others who would come after her. She returned to Oklahoma with a sense of satisfaction and completion. She had proven herself to the Eastern establishment that had once dismissed her. But more importantly, she no longer needed their validation. She had built a meaningful life and career on her own terms, with Owen as her partner and supporter every step of the way. The 1920s were good years for their family. Oliver completed his graduate work and took a position teaching at the university level while conducting his own field research. Emma studied art and scientific illustration in Kansas City, then returned home to work as a freelance illustrator for various scientific publications. Margaret continued her research and writing, though at a slower pace as she moved into her 50s. She focused more on synthesis and theory, drawing on her decades of field observations to develop broader ideas about ecosystem function and plant community dynamics. Her work was increasingly cited by other researchers, and she was recognized as having laid important groundwork for the developing field of ecology. Owen remained her constant companion and partner. They would still ride out together, though not as far or as frequently as they once had. But the wonder they had shared in those early days never faded. Owen still pointed out tracks and weather signs, and Margaret still stopped to examine interesting plants. They had built a life around their shared curiosity about the natural world, and that foundation had proven strong enough to support them through everything. In 1930, Margaret was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Oklahoma in recognition of her contributions to botanical science. The ceremony was held in Norman, and their whole family attended. Oliver, now 30, was there with his wife and infant son. Emma, at 23, had recently become engaged to a fellow artist. They all watched as Margaret crossed the stage in academic robes, finally receiving the formal recognition that had been denied her so long ago. Owen watched from the audience, his eyes bright with tears of pride. He thought back to that day over 30 years ago when he had first seen Margaret kneeling in the dust, studying a plant with complete absorption. He had been captivated by her then, and he was captivated by her still. She was 63 now, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face lined by years of sun and wind. But to him, she was as beautiful as she had been when he first kissed her in that lined shack during a storm. After the ceremony, as they walked back to their car with their family around them, Owen took Margaret's hand. "Dr. Morrison," he said with a smile. "How does it feel?" "Like vindication," Margaret said, "but also like a beginning. There is still so much work to do, so much to learn and document." "Always the scientist," Owen said fondly. "Always," Margaret agreed. She looked at her husband, her children, her grandson, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "But also always your wife, always their mother. I got to have everything, Owen. A career, a family, a partner who believed in me. Not many women of my generation can say that." "You made it happen," Owen said. "You refused to accept the limitations everyone tried to put on you." "We made it happen," Margaret corrected. "You and me together. I could not have done any of this without you." They drove back to their property outside Enid, as the sun set over the Oklahoma plains. The land looked much as it had when they first arrived all those years ago, still wild and beautiful and full of secrets waiting to be discovered. Their house stood solid on the prairie, lights glowing warm in the gathering darkness. Margaret and Owen had created something remarkable together. A partnership based on mutual respect and love, a family that valued curiosity and learning, a body of scientific work that would outlast them both. They had proved that it was possible to live an unconventional life and not just survive but thrive. As they walked up to their house that evening, Oliver called out, "I am cooking dinner." Everyone inside. Emma was already setting the table, and the baby was making happy noises in his portable crib. It was chaos and noise and love, everything Margaret had never known she wanted, until Owen had helped her see it was possible. That night, after everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Margaret and Owen sat together on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Oklahoma sky. Owen's arm was around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, comfortable after decades of nights just like this. "What are you thinking about?" Owen asked, his voice quiet in the darkness. "I am thinking about that first day you introduced yourself," Margaret said. "When I realized you had been watching me for weeks, I should have been angry, but I was just intrigued. You saw me in a way no one else had. You saw my work as something valuable, my passion as something worth supporting. I saw a woman kneeling in the dirt, talking to a barrel cactus, completely absorbed in what she was doing," Owen said. "I saw someone who looked at the world with wonder and wanted to understand it. How could I not fall in love with that? I studied desert plants for science," Margaret said softly, "and you studied me until I noticed you." Owen laughed quietly. "Best decision I ever made, spending those 2 weeks watching you work before I got up the courage to introduce myself. Best decision I ever made, accepting your help and your friendship and eventually your love," Margaret replied. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the night sounds of the prairie surrounding them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and an owl hooted from the barn. The land they had spent decades studying and protecting continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human drama but endlessly fascinating to those who took the time to observe. "You have any regrets?" Owen asked eventually. Margaret considered the question seriously. "I regret that I never reconciled with my parents. I wish they could have understood my choices, been proud of what I accomplished. But I do not regret the choices themselves. I regret nothing about our life together." "Neither do I," Owen said. He kissed the top of her head. "You gave me a life I never could have imagined. Adventure and purpose and love. You taught me to see the world with new eyes. You gave me the freedom to do my work," Margaret said. "And you gave me a partnership, a true partnership where we built something together. That was rarer than any plant species I ever discovered." They stayed on the porch until late, talking about their life together, about their children and their work, about plans for the future. They were older now, their bodies not as strong as they once were, but their minds were sharp and their love had only deepened with time. In the years that followed, they continued their work together, though at a gentler pace. Margaret published one final book, a memoir combined with reflections on desert ecology and the importance of preserving natural habitats. It became her most widely read work, accessible to general audiences while still containing valuable scientific observations. Emma illustrated the book, providing drawings that were both artistically beautiful and scientifically accurate. Working together on the project brought mother and daughter closer, and Emma came to appreciate fully the magnitude of what Margaret had accomplished against such significant obstacles. Oliver's research built on Margaret's foundation, and he frequently cited her work in his own publications. He made sure that her contributions to the field were recognized and remembered, and he encouraged his students to read her books and understand the context in which she had done her groundbreaking work. Margaret and Owen's grandchildren grew up hearing stories about the early days, about their grandmother documenting plants in the wild Oklahoma Territory, and their grandfather watching over her. They learned that love and partnership could take many forms, and that supporting each other's dreams was one of the highest expressions of devotion. Margaret Morrison passed away peacefully in the spring of 1945 at the age of 78, with Owen holding her hand. Her last words were about a plant she had spotted that morning from the window, a rare early bloomer that she wanted Owen to photograph for her. Even at the end, her mind was engaged with the natural world she had spent a lifetime studying. Owen lived another 5 years, and he spent that time organizing and preserving Margaret's papers and specimens. He worked with Oliver to donate her collection to the University of Oklahoma, where it formed the core of a new herbarium dedicated to Oklahoma Territory flora. He made sure her scientific contributions were properly documented and archived so that future researchers could build on her work. Owen Morrison died quietly in his sleep in 1950, at the age of 75. His children found him in his favorite chair on the porch, facing east toward the sunrise, a photograph of Margaret on the table beside him. He was buried next to her in the small cemetery outside Enid, their headstones side by side as they had been side by side in life. Their property was preserved by the family and eventually donated to become a nature preserve and field research station. Margaret Morrison Research Station opened in 1955, providing facilities for scientists studying prairie and desert ecology. Students and researchers from around the world came to work there, walking the same land Margaret had explored, studying the descendants of the plants she had first documented. Oliver served as director of the research station until his retirement, ensuring that it lived up to his mother's legacy of rigorous science and environmental stewardship. Emma's illustrations hung in the main building, visual reminders of the beauty and complexity of the ecosystem they were all working to understand and protect. In time, Margaret Morrison's name became known to every student of desert botany and ecology. Her books remained in print, valued not just for their scientific content, but for their elegant prose and detailed illustrations. She was remembered as a pioneer who had refused to accept the limitations placed on her, who had done groundbreaking scientific work despite institutional barriers, and who had shown that it was possible to have both a career and a family if you had the right partner. And Owen Morrison was remembered too, not just as Margaret's husband but as a partner who had enabled her success through his unwavering support. Their relationship became an example of what was possible when two people truly respected and supported each other, when they built a life around shared values and mutual encouragement. The land outside Enid, Oklahoma still holds their legacy. The plants they studied and documented continue their cycles, adapted perfectly to the harsh environment that Margaret found so fascinating. The research station bearing her name continues to advance scientific understanding of desert ecosystems. And their descendants carry forward the values they embodied: curiosity, courage, partnership, and love. Their story, which began with a botanist studying plants and a cowboy studying her, became a testament to the power of love to transcend social barriers and expectations. They proved that true partnership means supporting each other's dreams, that unconventional paths can lead to extraordinary lives, and that the greatest discoveries sometimes have nothing to do with science and everything to do with finding the person who sees you, truly sees you, and loves what they find. In the end, Margaret studied desert plants and made significant contributions to scientific knowledge. But Owen studied her, learned her, loved her, and together they created something even more remarkable than academic achievement. They created a life of meaning and purpose, a family built on respect and love, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Their love story unfolded against the backdrop of the wild Oklahoma Territory at the turn of the 20th century, a time and place of vast possibilities and harsh realities. But they met every challenge together, supporting each other through difficulties, celebrating each other's triumphs, and building something beautiful in that harsh landscape. And if you visit the Margaret Morrison Research Station today, you can still see echoes of their love in everything around you. In the careful preservation of the land they studied, in the scientific work that continues in her name, in the photographs that show a young woman kneeling in the dust beside a plant, and a young man on horseback watching over her, in the documented evidence of a partnership that defied expectations and proved that love, real love, means giving your partner the freedom to become who they are meant to be while standing beside them every step of the way. That is what Owen gave Margaret, and what she gave him in return. The freedom to be fully themselves, the support to pursue their passions, and the love that made everything else possible. It was a remarkable gift, and they honored it every day of their long lives together. Their story ended as all stories must, with death and loss. But what they built together, the love and work and family and legacy, that endures. It endures in the plants that still grow wild on the Oklahoma plains, in the research station that bears Margaret's name, in the scientific knowledge she contributed, and in the example they provided of what a true partnership can achieve. The botanist studied desert plants for science, documenting species and making discoveries that advanced human knowledge. The cowboy studied her until she noticed him, then spent the rest of his life supporting her work and loving her completely. And together, they proved that the greatest adventures come not from choosing between love and ambition, but from finding someone who helps you pursue both. Their love story became legend in the scientific community and in the ranching communities around Enid. It was retold in articles and books, taught in classes, and shared among families. Not because it was dramatic or tragic, but because it was real and lasting and built on the solid foundation of mutual respect, support, and genuine affection. They were ordinary people who did extraordinary things, not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through daily choices to support each other, to work together, and to build a life that honored both of their dreams. They showed that it was possible to bridge different worlds, to combine science and frontier life, to be both a respected professional and a devoted spouse and parent. In doing so, they created a template that others could follow, proving that women could pursue scientific careers, that men could support their wives' ambitions without diminishing their own worth, and that partnership based on equality and respect led to richer, fuller lives for everyone involved. When Owen first saw Margaret kneeling in the Oklahoma dust, studying a plant with complete absorption, he had no idea that this woman would transform his entire life. He just knew she was interesting, different, worth watching, and eventually worth knowing. And when Margaret finally noticed Owen watching her, she had no idea that this cowboy would become her greatest supporter, her dearest friend, her life partner in every sense of the word. But that is how the best love stories begin. Not with certainty, but with curiosity. Not with grand declarations, but with small moments of connection that grow into something extraordinary over time. Their story reminds us that love is not about finding someone who completes you, but about finding someone who supports you in becoming more fully yourself. Margaret Morrison became a renowned botanist not despite her unconventional life, but because of it. Owen Morrison lived a rich and meaningful life, not by following traditional paths, but by choosing to walk beside a remarkable woman and support her dreams. Together, they proved that the American West of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, for all its challenges and constraints, still offered space for people willing to forge their own paths and define their own lives. Their legacy lives on not just in preserved specimens and scientific publications, but in every woman who pursues a scientific career, in every man who supports his partner's ambitions, in every couple who builds a true partnership based on mutual respect and love. They showed us what was possible, and in doing so, they expanded the possibilities for everyone who came after them. The desert plants Margaret studied still bloom and seed and adapt to their harsh environment, following cycles established millions of years ago. But the human story that unfolded among those plants, the love story between the botanist and the cowboy, continues to inspire and instruct, reminding us that the most important discoveries are often not about the natural world but about the human heart and its infinite capacity for love.